hopefully I'll say a lot of smart things in front of this distinguished audience, especially in front of my two bosses, Brooke and Tu, we have a huge admiration for. Let me tell you up front two things. First of all, we all know we're having a good year for the economy this year. I'll talk a bit more about that. I think next year will be even better. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you look at all the reforms that the government is doing, if everything comes to pass, or most of it comes to pass, I think that these reforms would add about 2 percentage points to Vietnam's long-term GDP growth. So if everything more or less happens, our GDP growth will be 2 percentage points higher than it would have been otherwise, okay? So let me start by talking a little bit first about what's going on this year and next year. You probably know that we have let me just start by saying we have two things that are really pushing up the economy this year, and that's exports to the US and also the tourists coming from China. These are kind of the two main things that are really giving us a very high GDP growth this year. Without those two, the economy would still be okay, but it would be just kind of bumbling along, okay? If you look at the real retail sales, so this is retail sales stripping out inflation, actually it doesn't look too bad, around 7.5%. But I think if you strip out all these tourists that are coming, this number would be something like around 5%. And those of you that are in consumer businesses, you will have noticed that your revenues this year are okay. They're not like super weak, but they're just sort of bumbling along. And I'm speaking of people who companies that sell products to local Vietnamese consumers, okay? So I think if that would be around 5%, okay? What we're expecting for next year is a recovery of the consumption by local consumers. And I'll show you why I think that's gonna happen. So this is the first thing we expect for next year. The next thing we expect for next year is that the exports to the US are very, very strong this year, like almost 30%, which is incredible. And I think what's gonna happen next year is it's not gonna like collapse, but it's gonna come back down to kind of a more normal type level. So there's two things I'm saying for next year. First of all, exports to the US are very high and are gonna come back down to kind of more normal type level. And the second thing is that the consumption by local Vietnamese consumers is a little bit low, and it's gonna come up to more kind of normal level. So basically, we think these things are gonna kind of cancel each other out. And of course, the other thing that's going on is there's an enormous amount of dispersion for the infrastructure spending. The government is, in English, we'd say writing checks. They're writing checks a lot, a lot of spending going on. But what we tried to show on this chart here is there's actually a big difference between the amount of money that the government has committed to new infrastructure projects and actually how quickly the actual construction is growing. And actually, if you think about it, it's kind of normal because these are really big projects and it takes time to buy land, to get the approvals. Maybe you have to buy some construction material. So I think that the way to think about this is kind of a delayed boost to the economy that's gonna boost the economy next year. So we have three things coming together. Exports come back down to normal, consumption comes up to normal, and then we have the delayed effect of all this disbursement of infrastructure. You add those all together, I think next year is gonna be a pretty good year for the economy. This is a slide that we show to foreign investors, and I think, in this audience, you all know this already, but we like to illustrate to the foreigners like how many amazing infrastructure projects are happening and are planned. For me, personally, I think that the north-south highway is much more important than most people realize. Why? Because all the FDI manufacturing is kind of clustered in a few areas in Vietnam. And so the demand for labor in these areas is very high. But if you think about it, if we have like a really good infrastructure, the length of the country, that will allow factories to locate in more places and they can hire workers in all those places and get their products to the market. So I think out of all the things happening, there's a lot to be excited about. For me, I think that the North-South Highway is more important than most people realize. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about this consumption picture that I mentioned. This is, again, the real retail sales, and you take away inflation. We don't want to get confused. And what you can see here is the growth of real retail sales never really recovered back to the pre-COVID type levels, the sort of 8 or 9 percent type growth level. You see here we're below the long-term, pre-COVID levels. And don't forget, I just mentioned that if you take away the tourists that are coming, this number would be even lower. So why is this happening? Well, I think the biggest thing, which you all will know much better than me, is that during the COVID time, the households in Vietnam depleted their savings. They spent all their savings. Not everyone, but a lot of households did. And so what's been happening since the COVID time is that normal households have been saving at a very high rate. So their incomes are going up at around a 6 or 7% rate. They're growing, so that's good. But what they're doing is, with the extra income, they're just saving it. They're not spending it. So the reason why I expect consumption to kind of recover back up to a normal growth rate next year is it's not like a very deep, complicated analysis. A lot of times in economics, if you try to make too much mathematics, you can get lost. And we should think about things in a very simple, clear way. And what we're thinking about is we're saying, how much higher is the savings rate in Vietnam right now compared to the pre-COVID? There's a couple different estimates of how much higher it is. I think it could be as much as 10 percentage points higher. In other words, like for a normal household, if they used to save 20% of their income, for example, pre-COVID, I think it could be as high as almost 30% because they're trying to rebuild their savings. There are not really good statistics on that, but in my mind, everyone agrees that it's much higher than the savings in Vietnam is much higher than it was pre-COVID. So what I'm thinking is, if you look at how much higher the savings rate has been elevated and how long this has been going on for, actually you can just do some calculation and you can say, okay, I think probably by the middle of next year, maybe the households will not have rebuilt all of their savings, but they probably should have rebuilt enough that they feel comfortable to start spending at a more normal pace. So that's one factor. Obviously, the stock market being up 30% makes people feel more wealthy, real estate market's healthy, et cetera. So I think you mix all these together, and I think next year is going to be a pretty good year for consumption. And you will see consumer businesses on the stock market, their revenues will start to recover. Now, it's not clear yet the impact of the floods. We have to look at that more carefully. But so far, we don't see, that it's very terrible human tragedy. And at Vienna Capital, we've, like a lot of places, we've tried to collect and, send food and money to the areas of the country that need it. But I'm not really clear yet if this is going to derail what I talked about so far here. The other thing to be aware of is that, of course, Vietnam's biggest export market is the US. There's something very, very specific going on in the US that you should know kind of in the back of your head. This is something that people call the K-shaped economy, like the letter K. So the letter K has an upper part and it has a lower part. What this story is all about is the idea that in the US, and this is kind of unfortunate from a social point of view, but in the US, the consumers that are kind of on the upper part of this K, so these are like upper middle class people, this is people who own their own home with no mortgage, people who have money in the stock market, people who have money in the bank. In the US, the interest rates went up a lot after COVID. Well, if you have your money in the bank, that means you're getting more income. So these people that are on the upper part of the K, what this chart shows you is that in my adult lifetime, they went from something like 1/3 of all the spending in the US to like almost a half. So again, from a social point of view, this is really too bad. But from Vietnam's point of view, we kind of only have to care about the upper middle class and the rich people in the US, and they're doing fine. So our exports to the US will be healthy again next year. In the short term, all the metrics in Vietnam look good. Everything looks good, except for one, which is the FX reserves. So the FX reserves in Vietnam, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. What the World Bank and others would say is that, well, your FX reserves are less than 3 months worth of imports, and that's kind of below the minimum that you should have. What the SBV would say against that, which is kind of a good point, is they would say, yeah, but a lot of the things Vietnam imports, that's the material for the FDI companies. And if you look at how much Vietnam imports that we actually consume here, automobiles, consumer products, stuff like that, then the FX reserve is closer to 6 months. It's not a bad argument. But anyhow, the net result of having FX reserves that a lot of people think are too low is one of the results has that we've had a depreciation in the dong this year, as everybody knows. Unfortunately, next year, I think the economy is going to do very strong. My personal view, this is only my view, this is not the Vina Capital view, and maybe they agree, we haven't really talked exactly, but I think the stock market's going to go up like another 25% next year. This is my own personal investing, what I think. However, I think we're going to have a very strong economy next year. I think we're going to have a very strong stock market next year, but I do think that we're going to have some more depreciation in the dong. That's partially because what I just showed with the FX reserves. And also, to really put it bluntly, we really applaud all the efforts that the government is doing to stimulate the economy. Interest rates in Vietnam are probably a little bit lower than they really need to be in terms of the currency. Some of you may know, if you follow this, that we had a big spike in the interbank rate mark the last couple days to up around 7%. It's actually peaked at 7 and come back down a little bit now. What we've seen the SBV do, and I completely understand their thinking, is to prioritize trying to keep the interest rates from, they don't want the rates to go too high because they want the economy to support the economy. When you're a policymaker, you're always like balancing things. It's a very difficult job, for them to do. And right now, I think what they're trying to do is they want to limit the depreciation of the dong, but at the same time, they want the growth to be strong. So that's why they try to inject money into the economy and not let their interest rates get too high. But the net result of that is I think we will have some more depreciation in the currency next year. I'm not worried about inflation. China's economy is very weak. Vietnam's food prices are very influenced by what happens in China. Again, the floods may put a little bit more inflation next year, probably less than 4%. That's what I'm expecting. I want to talk a little bit now about how we think about the long-term, the DIệu NG 2.0 reforms. I've been here for almost 20 years, and I can say that in our meetings with civil servants in the government, this is the most we've ever seen, and a lot of other foreigners have commented on the same thing. This is the most proactive that we see people that we meet in the government. They're very, listening to our ideas, taking notes, very proactive. And so I think the first and foremost, there's a lot of information coming out. In English, we call drinking from a fire hose. You have this hose of water is like coming like crazy. And it's hard to, there's so many different details, different resolutions, goals, this kind of stuff. And that's all important. But what I tell to my foreigner investor friends is the first thing you should think about is that it's a big change in how the people within the government are approaching the country's long-term future. This is probably the most important thing that you need to know more than anything. So again, we think that will add around 2 percentage points to the GDP growth. Something very important for investors, particularly us as private equity investors, is that right now in Vietnam, you have this amazing growth driver, which is all the FDI coming into the country. And that will still be there because Vietnam has still a lot of competitive advantages versus other countries for FDI. But something very interesting is that these domestic reforms will open up a lot more investment opportunities. So let's just think about this for a second. When Samsung comes here and they make a factory, this is great for the country. We hire a lot of workers, they're employed, they have a salary. But actually, part of the economic value that Samsung creates when they make these phones, yeah, they send back to Korea. It doesn't stay here. So we're getting part of the benefit of them being here, but not all the benefit. So the more that growth can be driven by domestic opportunities, first of all, it's going to benefit the country more, but for us, particularly in private equity investing, it's going to open up a lot more investment opportunities. So that's what we're trying to convey on this slide here. Okay, I want to finish by just giving 3 of my own personal ideas or recommendations about the long-term growth for Vietnam. The first recommendation is that Vietnam is currently following what's called the East Asian development model. And this is the same development model that Japan, Taiwan, Korea, it's basically the same approach that all these other countries that became very successful used. So this is wonderful. We really applaud, the government that they're taking this approach. What we're thinking is, if you want to make Vietnam even more competitive against other countries in the world, kind of do the same thing. Like, what we're doing right now is we're just kind of copying what worked in Japan, what worked in Taiwan. So what we're saying is, hey, just really even copy more what the other countries did, especially the countries that are really successful in high tech. There's this very famous business school professor, Michael Porter. He was here in Vietnam. They did a big study and they gave some recommendations. He's very famous for an idea that's called clusters, industrial clusters. And so the first, what would be our recommendation for the long-term growth is, just like Vietnam is kind of copying this East Asian development model, just go ahead and even copy more of his ideas. You don't need to, this is the expression in English, reinvent the wheel. The way to get rich is already clear, so just follow what the other countries did. We're kind of half following now, and our recommendation would be 100% follow. So that's one thing. The second thing we want to mention, and I think many, many people know this, is that the cost of capital in Vietnam, when companies here want to borrow money or equity money, is higher than our competitors. So there's a couple things that we need to do there to bring that down. First of all, we've made a huge step with getting the FTSE upgrade, and now what we need to do is follow through and also get the MSCI upgrade. So if we have both of these to EM status, that will help lower the cost of capital in Vietnam. And of course, that's something a lot of people have been talking about. Here's something that people have not really been talking about, which is also very important, maybe even more important. We need to get an investment grade credit rating. We're basically one notch below, more or less one notch below, having a proper investment grade credit rating. This will lower the cost of capital in Vietnam. And actually, what we've seen in the past is countries, when they get upgraded to, you look at Indonesia, Philippines, their stock market goes up a lot. Even though this has to do with borrowing in the international capital markets, their stock market usually goes up a lot once they get that. An investment grade credit rating is within Vietnam's reach. I believe that right now the plan by the government is to do this by 2030. I think it's achievable much faster than that. So I showed all the metrics that Vietnam, we have very low government debt to GDP. Lots of other things are, we already checked the box on a lot of them. And the third thing is, of course, if the government can follow through with its plans to make and establish a proper international financial center, this would also bring down the cost of capital in Vietnam, because there would be more money flowing into the country. So we think this should really, I think it's kind of already a priority, but it should be even a double priority or something like that, because it will benefit many more companies than people realize. And the last thing I want to mention is, of course, AI is really, really big topic in the news now, and everybody's, sees it in the newspaper all the time. So I'm going to say something right now, which is that I have a computer science background. That's my way back when. My belief is that Vietnam and Vietnamese engineers in particular have a unique advantage in this field of artificial intelligence. You see this book right here. This is, if you go to Amazon, you can look up this book. She is from the countryside. Many of you know her, of course, because she used to write the travel type books. But she got a scholarship to study computer science at Stanford, where also I studied computer science there. And now she's this big. This is the #1 book in AI right now. So I think that this is just one example I can give. I can give 10 more examples if we had another hour to talk about it. But the key message that I want to leave with you right now is that the number of experts in the field of AI that come from Vietnam is way more than a country of this size you would expect. So we have some kind of special advantage in AI, and I think we should really, really focus on developing that industry here. So that would be my last recommendation.
DIOD, nơi các giá trị tri thức được cập nhật và chia sẻ, nơi kết nối các thành viên hội đồng quản trị, nơi bắt đầu phát triển nghề quản trị công ty ở Việt Nam.